Calvary, first and fourth verse. Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not what the Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me He died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burden so found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burden so found liberty at Calvary.
Appreciate, again, Jimmy leading us in music, and appreciate you being here, and appreciate you guys watching us online, especially if you're some of our church folks and you're not able to be with us in person. We really appreciate you tuning in tonight, watching us online, or whenever you may watch this. We're in Leviticus chapter 12. This one's only 8 verses. We'll go through it pretty quick. Then we'll start chapter 13. This is the section that's on uncleanness, purification. If you remember, we talked about the first 7 or 8 chapters are they're legalistic, they're requirements, rules, all the sacrifices. Then he gets into a narrative section, and then when you start chapter 11, it goes back to the legal requirements. And from chapter 11 to 15, it's all purification. What makes you unclean? Last week, chapter 11 was all about food, the foods that we eat, and he gave us different kinds of clean and unclean animals. So you can eat this, you can't eat this, and he divided it into 3. One of the things that you'll see as you go through any writing of Moses, whether it's Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, he always groups things, most of the time in 3s. He groups situations. And so he in chapter 11, he says these are the land animals, these are the fish, these are the birds that you can eat. Now we're in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is all about motherhood and childbirth. Then when we get to chapter 13, it's going to change again. But if you look at the progression through chapters 11 through 15, chapter 11 is basically laws affecting human environment. What's going on around you, what you can eat. Chapter 12 is on childbirth. And then chapter 13 through 15 is laws affecting everyday life. This is where he gets into what you can wear, skin diseases, and I'll show you when we get to chapter 13 how, and I'll explain the difference. Sometimes when translators are translating from Hebrew to English or Greek to English, they actually translate. We take the Hebrew word and we translate it. Sometimes what they call transliterate, and you just take the Hebrew or the Greek word and you just kind of turn it into an English word based on the way it sounds. And that happened in chapter 13, and I think it's wrong, and it gave a wrong impression of what the Bible's actually talking about. So look at chapter 12. Starting in verse 1. Actually, let me say this before we start this. This all parallels, everything he's going to talk about really in these chapters parallels the fall. It's all kind of directly correlated to what happened with Adam and Eve in the garden and the fall. And so when we read this and go through this, that's kind of what he's talking about. Look at verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, When a woman gives birth and bears a male child, they shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. Now, let's talk about this uncleanness. because we always hear this when you talk about Old Testament, and even some of the New Testament. They always talk about what's unclean, what makes somebody unclean. There's two kinds of uncleanliness that's recorded in the Bible. One is a moral transgression, and one is just a ceremonial defilement. So there's a moral thing, and there's a ceremonial thing. When you commit a moral transgression, that renders you spiritually defiled. That's something that you have to something that where you sin. I actually did something. It was a moral failure. I did something. I sinned. It caused an uncleanliness in me, and so now I have to purify myself through a sacrifice or whatever in order to get rid of the sin. All right. Then there's a ceremonial uncleanliness, and a ceremonial uncleanliness is it's something that's not morally wrong, like childbirth in chapter 12. There's nothing wrong with having a baby, but it renders you unclean, but it's not a sin. So not all uncleanliness is related to a sin. There's some that's just you accidentally touch something or do something, and you're rendered unclean. So unclean. The whole reason I told you that is because I want you to remember this. Uncleanliness, just because you say the word unclean, does not mean sinful. Most of the time when we talk about the Old Testament, we hear the word unclean, it automatically calls to mind somebody's sin. Somebody did something, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just a ritual thing or a ceremonial thing, as in the case of chapter 12. Now, look here, and we'll go through these real quick, because all he does is really talk about when you have a boy and when you have a girl. Look at verse 1 again. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this is how they all start, all these chapters. In verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, she'll be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. Verse 3, on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Verse 4, then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. So I don't know if you get this or not, but here's what he's saying. If a woman gives birth to a son, then she is going to spend 7 days right after the childbirth, just like a cycle time. And at the end of those 7 days, it extends for another 33. So for 40 days total, after you have a son, for 40 days total, you can't go to the synagogue, you can't touch another person, you have to kind of separate yourself for 40 days. All right? So that's what he's saying. When you have a son, separate for 40 days. And then he throws this in there on the 8th day of this, and God didn't really, I don't think, arbitrarily pick 8 days. He said on the 8th day, circumcise your son. Modern tests and stuff show that really on the 8th day is the best day even now to do that, which I didn't realize till I started kind of researching all this, because somehow the clotting is better on not just around 8 days, but on the 8th day. So for whatever that's worth. So God actually, I think, knows what he's doing. So if you have a son, you basically have 40 days. 40 days you're away from everybody. No contact, no church, no sacrifices, no anything. All right, now look at verse 5. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks. So we're talking about 14 days, as in her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. So if you have a son, it's 7 plus 33, 40 days. If you have a daughter, it's 14 plus 66, 80 days. So it's double. So the time of your uncleanliness, and again, it's not sinful uncleanliness, it's ceremonial. So you have a son, you basically separate for 40 days. Can't be around anybody, can't touch anybody, can't go to church, make sacrifices, and that stuff. If you have a female, if you have a daughter, then you separate for 80 days. So for 80 days, you don't go to church, you don't make sacrifices, no human contact. People stay away from you for 80 days. And again, that's so it's just twice as long. Now, there's a lot of theories on why it's double, And I'll tell you which one I think, but there's a lot of them. The first theory says that one reason, and I mean, it could be true, I don't know, but one reason, one school of thought says if you have a female child, if you have a daughter, then that daughter could possibly grow up one day to have a child herself, and that child would be a sinner. So this lady has a daughter, is bringing in another life that could possibly bring another sinner into the world. And so you separate for 80 days, you purify for 80 days. I don't think that really holds a lot of water. I don't think that's a good thing. The second one is that, and again, you have to be a really strong male chauvinist, but the second theory is men are better. So if you have a male child, men are just genetically superior to female. So you only have to do 40 days, but it takes longer for a female. So if you hold that view, best probably keep it to yourself. Right? The third view is that all this follows the curse, because remember, all this relates to the curse. It's all after the fall. And so the third view of this is a woman separates longer for a female child because it directly relates to the curse on Eve and her children and her gender, her sex. That's the curse of Eve. That's what I kind of think probably is right, because that's one of the fallouts from the curse is Eve's, her whole gender was cursed under the fall. The fourth one says that the bleeding after childbirth for a female lasts longer than it does a male. I don't think that's medically true, so I ruled that one out. And the fifth one says that maybe it's just that the mother needs more time to bond with the daughter than she does the son. I don't really think that's correct either. So I think that the reason it's double for a daughter is that it just takes it just takes you back to the fall, and that's a result of the fall. And then in this chapter, he talks about circumcision, and that's really all it is to that, except for, look at the end. In verse 6, when the days of her purification are completed, the 40 days or the 80 days, for a son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. It's interesting to me that, well, let me explain it like this. She has to do this because she's ceremonially unclean. So she takes the offerings to the priest, and she gives it to the priest, and the priest will deem her clean. And she gives a trespass offering to the Lord, and because for 40 days or for 80 days, she's made no sacrifices. She hadn't done what she's supposed to do in the synagogue or in the temple, and so she's now able to go back and make sacrifices, and she's actually atoning for the fact that she's missed 40 days or 80 days of going to church. It's basically what this is. And so so it says you could take a 1-year-old lamb or a young pigeon or a turtle dove. Mary, the mother of Jesus, according to Luke's gospel, they were so poor, her and Joseph, that she brought the turtle dove. And God made an exception. He said, I want you to be able to do this. And just because you can't afford a lamb or a bull or something like that, you can bring a turtle dove. Well, Mary brought that after Jesus was born, which is interesting to me. Verse 8, but if she cannot afford a lamb, then she'll take 2 turtle doves, 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make atonement for her, and then she'll be clean. So that's childbirth. That's the uncleanliness due to childbirth. It is ceremonial. It's not a sin. It's just that it involves blood. And when Hebrew people talked about blood, it was it's an unnatural state. Remember we talked about all these different kind of animals that God said was clean and unclean, and some of them he said they don't have enough toes on their hooves, and some of the animals were paws. It doesn't really look like an animal's print when it's in the ground, and so it looks unnatural. It looks abnormal, and so all these things that have to do with blood, like childbirth or diseases we'll talk about next, it's unclean because it's not a natural state. I mean, a human being in the normal doesn't bleed. Don't just walk around with cuts pouring off of. If we're bleeding somehow, then it's an unnatural state of things. It's not the natural order. And so I think that's why childbirth's included in this. Now, any question about chapter 12? All right, chapter 13. This is just for curiosity. Because I think my Bible's wrong in this. I think the heading's wrong. Above chapter 13, the big heading says the test for leprosy. Anybody's Bible say the test for leprosy or have the word leprosy in there and somehow? All right, that's not right. And I'll show why it's not right, because it's not just leprosy. It's not what he's talking about. And I'll explain it to you. There's most of the translations confuse people with this. Because when you read that, the test for leprosy, what's your mind automatically think when you read chapter 13? It's all about lepers. And so you're conditioning yourself to say, when I read this, now the heading tells me this is about leprosy, so everything I read is about leprosy. However, the word leprosy is not what the actual word translates to, and it's actually the way they defined the word leper in Hebrew is not the same as we define it now. When we talk about leprosy now, it's Hansen's disease. Anybody knows anything about medicine? Leprosy is actually called Hansen's disease. That's the formal name of the disease. But that's not what they're talking about. And so our modern interpretation is different from the Hebrew interpretation. And so I'll let me, without getting too technical, the Septuagint that was translated centuries ago. In the Septuagint means 70, Septu is 70. In the Septuagint, 70 Greek scholars translated the ancient Hebrew, the Old Testament Hebrew, into Greek. So basically you have an Old Testament written in Greek, a translation in Greek. There's one in my office if you want to look at it. When the translators of the Septuagint translated the word leper, which is what it is, L-E-P-E-R, they didn't translate it. They transliterated it. And so when you look at it in Hebrew and it's L-E-P-E-R, automatically they're thinking, well, that's leper. That's our English word. So instead of actually going back and looking at the cognate of the Latin or the Hebrew and seeing what it actually means, we're just going to put the English meaning to it. So when they saw the word L-E-P-E-R, they said, well, that's leprosy. We know what that is. But that's not the right word. The Hebrew word is actually tassera'at. And it means a wide variety of issues that affects your skin and clothing. As a matter of fact, when we get to chapter 14, it will use that same word leper, and it'll say that this disease, this idea, affects your clothing and your household articles with mold and mildew. Hansen's disease don't do that. Hansen's disease don't affect your clothes. Don't put mildew on your clothes. But the ancient Hebrew word that they used covers all this. It covers skin. So where it says the test for leprosy, it ought to be the test for any skin or clothing defilement. Yes, ma'am.
So my Bible actually makes a note. It has a footnote at the bottom that says that leprosy was a term for several skin diseases.
That's right.
So it does make that note, at least in my
At least you got in your study note, it's got that note in there. Because that word, Sarahite, it can mean eczema, it can mean psoriasis, it can mean dandruff, anything that affects your skin, anything that affects your body, and then subsequently your household, so your clothing, like mildew and mold and those kind of things. It's all covered under that one word. And so when they translate the Bible, it's very important that they actually translate it, and they don't transliterate it. Like the word baptism, for example. Baptism, the Greek word is baptizo. So they didn't translate it. It means to immerse. but they don't translate it to that. They transliterate it to baptize, and it has a little bit of a different nuance to it. And so when we read chapter 13 and then chapter 14, it's all about different kind of skin diseases. And it's basically saying that anything that corrupts your skin or the covering of your skin is included in this. So as we read this, don't just think it's lepers. You know, a leper will get white spots on their hand, then it'll turn black, and then it'll be gangrenous, and their skin fingers will fall off. And all that. That's not exactly what he's talking about. If you have psoriasis, you're covered in this. And I'll show you the extent of it, because in this chapter, God lays it out for them to basically say, if it's depending on how it looks, the color of the disease that comes up on your skin, that's going to determine if you're unclean or if you're not, and how long you have to separate. So I know, you know, it gets a little technical with some of this stuff, but God is trying to make a people for himself, and God is trying to show them how to be a covenant in a covenant relationship. So that's the point of all this. So let's start with chapter 13, verse 1. We won't get through this whole chapter, but we're going to start it. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy, that's not Hansen's disease. That's any kind of skin disease. When it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. The priest shall look at the mark on the skin of his body, and if the hair in the infection is turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is an infection of leprosy, or in other words, it's a skin disease. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean. All right, so again, it's the chapter 13 and 14 is going to be just a series of tests that the priest runs on people. And look at the first one that he says in here. He says that the priest is going to, you come up to the priest, you got a white spot on your hand, or you got a scab on your hand, or a cut on your hand. You come up to the priest, got something, you know, a rash or something. Come to the priest, he's going to look at it. If the hair inside the wound or inside the rash is white, then he's going to determine you to be unclean. So it's the priest's job to do this. The priest has to inspect you. That's why when you read some of these stories in the Old Testament, even in the Gospels, some people have to present themselves before the priest to be declared clean. Because they'll have to go to the priest and say, here, I got this rash. He'll really inspect them and say, well, the hair inside there is white. You're fine. You're dirty. You're unclean. You have to separate. And then if the hair is different color, it's something different. Look at, let me see if I can do it this way. Because in this pericope, in this grouping of scripture, from chapter 13 to 14, God deals with 21 specific diseases. There's 21 different examples in these two chapters of different things that could be wrong. Most scholars take those 21 and group them into three groups. From chapter 2 to or verse 2 to verse 28. Look at, let me read these, and then I think I can explain the next grouping to you. When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. The priest shall look at the mark on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection is turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, is an infection of leprosy. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate him who has the infection for 7 days. So you're not unclean, you just got to separate for 7 days. If it is unclean, you have to separate till it's healed up. The priest shall look at him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the infection is not changed, and the infection is not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 more days. Remember why 7? It's the number of completion. That's the holy number. The priest shall look at him again on the seventh day, and if the infection is faded, the mark is not spread on the skin, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab spreads further on the skin after he's shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again to the priest. The priest shall look, and if the scab is spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. When the infection of leprosy is on a man, then he shall be brought to the priest. The priest shall then look at it and see if it's white, swelling on the skin. If it turned the hair white, there's quick raw flesh in the swelling. It is a chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. So you got to get healed. If the leprosy breaks out further on the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of him who has the infection from his head even to his feet, as far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and behold, if the leprosy has covered all of his body, he shall pronounce him clean. Pronounce clean him who has the infection. It all turned white and is clean. Your mind's getting numbed so far. When I read this, here's what I think. Thank goodness we don't do this, because I don't want you coming to me every time you get a rash and I have to inspect it. I don't want to do that. So I'm very, very grateful that God pushed us past this. All right. But if you read verses 2 through 28, here's the grouping. If it's a swelling or a scab and a bright spot. That's what he's talking about from verses 2 through 28. If it's swelling, if it's a scab or it's a bright spot. Things like psoriasis. That's what it's really describing. Psoriasis is a chronic, non-infectious skin disease. It's characterized by really well demarcated, slightly red places on the skin. That's what he's talking about in those verses. Something akin to psoriasis. If you look at verse 29, for example, verse 29 through verse 37, I'm not going to read them all, but I'll introduce it to you. If a man or woman has an infection on the head or on the beard, then the priest shall look at the infection. It appears to be deeper than the skin. There's thin yellowish hair in it. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a scale. It's leprosy of the head or of the beard. So the first pericope section is basically skin disease like psoriasis. The second one is head or beard type stuff. It can be a much more damaging infection, much more severe infection, and the priest is going to be charged with really inspecting it and see if it's a fungus or see again what color of the hairs inside the infection is. So that's head or beard. Verses 38 and 39 is the third section. Look at verse 38. When a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of his body, even white bright spots, then the priest shall look. If the bright spots on the skin of their bodies are a faint white, it is eczema that is broken out on the skin. He is clean. So we got leukoderma, eczema. Just for curiosity, how many of y'all know eczema specifically described in Scripture? It specifically calls out eczema, or was that a surprise to you? Over the course of those verses, of these two chapters, God delineates 21 different things. There's 21 things that can go wrong, that will cause you to have to go to a priest, but they're kind of inside those three groupings. It's either like a swelling or a scab, it's on your head or your beard, or it's a white spot a bright white spot on your skin. And so, again, you present yourself to the priest. The priest will inspect you. And he's going to look for things like open wounds, raw flesh, different kind of raised bumps, that kind of stuff. And he is going to determine whether or not you're clean or not. Look at, for example, verse 18 through verse 28. He brings up white hairs over and over and over again. Not a doctor. When I researched this from people who have actually researched all this, white hair in a deep infection or white hair in a scar is sometimes results in like a boil or something. And so you have that, especially in the Old Testament, it's a serious skin disease. And then when he talks about the beard, he talks about yellowish hair. It's another really abnormality. It's a serious thing. So when you read all this, again, my mind goes to, what's God's point for all this? Why you got to jump through all these hoops? Shouldn't you have a baby and when you feel better, just go back to life, go back to normal? When you get an infection, shouldn't you just put something on it, some hyssop or something, just rub it on it and go back about your business? God is really wanting to create something in these people. He's trying to create an atmosphere within them that sets them apart, keeps them consecrated, keeps them separate and holy. Because over and over again in these chapters, he says, you be holy because I'm holy. In other words, I'm setting a standard for you. And this is really not some of those impossible standards like Jesus set for us. This is just standards of hygiene and all, where I think part of it had to do with communicable diseases in this time would really take out a lot more people than they would now. But I think a lot of it is God is just wanting to separate his people, consecrate his people. And so God is telling them that you got to live this way. And then that's where the priestly class comes in. They're the arbiters of all this. So you go to the priest and say, I had a baby, and the priest will say, well, how long have you been isolated? Or how long has your purification been going on? You say 40 days. And then he'll make sure that everything's okay. Then he'll send you back to life. You do a sacrifice, you go back to living. Same with these diseases. You go up, you present yourself, he looks at them, and then he sends you back, and he says, you're clean now, you can go back. Now, all that, again, everything, without exception, everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. Everything's about him. And so when we translate this spiritually to what does that mean for us? What does it mean about Jesus? How does he come into all this? You and I are polluted. We're diseased from the inside out. Sin's ruined us. It is, we talk about skin disease and all that stuff. You and I were born with a heart defect. We're born with heart disease. We're no good. And so it's almost like God is saying to these people in the Old Testament, I'm holy. And I want you people to strive for that. Because I want to have a relationship with you. I want you to come to the tabernacle. I want you to come to the temple. I want you to go to synagogue. I want you to do these things. But if you're not clean, if you're not holy, then we can't commune. Because in the Old Testament, God would say, my presence is going to show up in that tabernacle. That's where that's where the Shekinah glory of God will reside. And if you want to interact with me, you're going to have to do it there. But you got to do it through a mediator, a priest, but you still do it there. And so all these people are like, okay, my whole life's going to revolve around, I have to go to the temple, I have to go to the tabernacle, I have to go make a sacrifice. And then God said, but you can't, because you got a skin disease, or you've got a ceremonially unclean nature. And so God is saying to them, before you can have communion with me, you got to clean yourself up. You got to fix yourself. And so God appointed the priests, and they were arbiters of that. That's yes, you're good to go now, or no, you're not. You got to separate more days. Now that Jesus has came, he's dealt with the biggest problem we have. The biggest problem is not skin disease and all that stuff; it's a heart disease. And so, because Jesus died for us on the cross, now God formerly looked at us and said, "I can't have a relationship with you because you're rotten on the inside. You have this black mark on your heart. There's a sin problem that's really messing you up, and you have to fix it." And for the life of us, we couldn't figure out a way to fix it. We didn't know how to fix that. How you fix your own sinfulness, when you're a sinful person. And so Jesus came and he died, and now God can say to us, once I accept Christ, the righteousness of Jesus is applied to my life. He clothes me with his righteousness. And when he puts his righteousness around me, now God can look at me, and just like the priest could these people, God can now declare me clean. I'm clean, but it's not because of something I did, it's because of something Jesus did. It's because of his perfection. And so all this in the Old Testament, even though these people are jumping to these hoops, and it doesn't seem like a big deal. I mean, if you get a skin infection, you just go to the priest, you wait till it heals, and you go back into your thing, you know. But it's all pointing to something more permanent. It's pointing to something better. Because think about if you have a problem with psoriasis, how often are you going to have to be separated? I mean, you get it, your skin gets diseased, and you go to the priest and say, yeah, you're unclean, separated. So you're separated for, 7 days. Come back, you're still another 7 days. You come back, another 7 days. You see, it extends out. Well, then you get healed, you come back, and then 6 months later you get another disease, you got to separate again. Jesus said, I come do this for you one time. We don't have to keep jumping through these hoops. You are clean once. Now, you and I sin, but there's forgiveness of that sin. There's payment for it when we pay for our sins, but there's forgiveness. The punitive nature of sin is done away with. We're not paying for it anymore, as far as it's not separating me from God anymore, because Jesus made a one-time sacrifice where he cleansed me from all that unrighteousness. That's what 1 John 1:9 says. If I confess my sin, then he is faithful to forgive me and to cleanse me of all my unrighteousness. He'll do that for us. We don't have to jump through all these hoops. So that's really the point of chapter 13 and 14. It really takes us through chapter 13. I'd like to pick up next week and finish chapter 14 and maybe get into chapter 15. Chapter 15 is more about sexual cleanliness and sexual uncleanliness. And then when we get to chapter 16, that's where the whole book changes. That's where it changes back into like a narrative form. And it talks about the Day of Atonement, which the Jews celebrate now as Yom Kippur. So if you ever look at a Jewish calendar and says Yom Kippur, that's what chapter 16 is about. It's the Day of Atonement. And the priests were instructed to do something very special that day, which also comes into play of something that happened when Jesus died on the cross that we'll talk about. But anyway, that's chapter 12 and 13. Any questions about those two? I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard to teach this stuff because I know it's not exciting to you, but it is biblical, and it does point to Jesus, and let's just get through it the best we can, and then we'll move on to something else. Yes, ma'am.
So is it like leprosy back then? It's like we still have that now, but it's like because it's medicine, it's not a big deal?
Well, what they would consider leprosy is any kind of skin disease, like psoriasis, eczema,
Which is not a big deal.
ringworm, that kind of stuff. We cure, it's curable. And back then it was. They could get rid of it. Most people didn't die from it, but they couldn't be around other people while it was because some of it was contagious, some of it wasn't. But the leprosy that we know of, which is really Hansen's disease, where you all that stuff, they had that too, but it's a different word. It's a different. This is not what it's talking about here. It is in the New Testament and other places, but not here.
Like you said, it was really to protect everyone from spreading things.
Yeah.
It's like they grouped everything into one group. It's
Yeah.
distinguishing between
Yeah.
seriousness.
Yeah, God's trying to protect them, and he's also trying to consecrate them. He's trying to set apart his people and make them live within certain frameworks, certain boundaries.
How sad for the ones that had things that weren't contagious.
Yeah.
So they went to the priest, but then they also seen doctors to be healed. It was just up to the priest to declare them healed.
That's their job.
But also they could get like misdiagnosed maybe and then get put in a colony and they didn't really need to be.
I'm sure. So you go to the priest says, yeah, you're unclean, then you go see a doctor, and the doctor says, here, wipe this hyssop on your, whatever it is. And then when you think it's clear, you go back to the priest, and he says yes or no.
So he wasn't necessarily a doctor.
Right. Yeah, priests and doctors, yeah, they had separate functions.
Dr. Downs.
Yeah. I'm not checking your. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Just say thank you, Lord. I'm living now.
Me too. There is There is so much benefit to living under grace that we take for granted all the time. Because we don't do any of this stuff. We eat what we want. We can come to church when we want. You know, we don't have this stuff. We have freedom in Jesus. Our what?
Are we all flying?
No. Anybody else? I appreciate it. We'll go ahead and dismiss now. Our online group, thank you guys for being